Okay, so picture this. You finally found the perfect location for your new cafe.
You've signed the lease. You've even ordered those cute little tables.
Right?
6 months in, things are going great.
Yeah.
The coffee's flowing, pastries are selling out. And then the rent checks stop coming.
It's the nightmare scenario for any landlord. You're relying on that income, and suddenly you're potentially looking at a legal battle.
Exactly. And it's not just about the money, is it? It's the stress, the uncertainty.
Yeah.
That feeling that you're stuck.
Absolutely.
So that's why today we're doing a deep dive into a solution that many haven't heard of, but it's way faster than duking it out in court. CRA, Commercial Rent Arrears Recovery.
It's like the legal express lane for commercial landlords in the UK who are dealing with tenants that just aren't paying up.
And it's important to say right off the bat, this isn't about, granny getting evicted. This is strictly business to business.
That's right.
So for all our listeners out there who own commercial property, consider this your CRAR cheat sheet.
We'll break down how it works, when you can use it, and importantly, when it might not be the silver bullet solution you might be hoping for.
So to start, let's make sure everyone's clear on what CRA actually is.
So, in the simplest terms, it's a legal tool that allows landlords to recover unpaid rent by having a certified enforcement agent, kind of like a bailiff but for business debts, seize and sell the tenant's assets.
Okay, so there's an image for you. Someone showing up and taking stuff.
Right.
But before we get to, the Repo Man style drama, let's talk ground rules. It's not a free-for-all, right?
Not at all, no. There are some pretty big caveats, and it all starts with that all-important lease agreement.
I'm a stickler for paperwork.
Good.
So, spill the legal tea.
Yeah.
How crucial is that lease in this whole CRA raw process?
It's non-negotiable. You'd be surprised how often, those verbal agreements, they come back to bite landlords, especially in a dispute with CRR. That written lease, it isn't just a formality, it's your legal ammunition.
Okay.
If it's not in writing, CRR is completely off the table.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So let's say we've got that signed lease.
Okay.
The tenant's ignoring your calls and rent day is come and gone. Is that enough to get the CRA ball rolling?
Not quite. Even with the lease, there's a minimum amount of rent that needs to be overdue. We're talking at least 7 days worth.
Right.
It's not about playing hardball over a late fee.
Right.
CIR is really designed for when there are substantial arrears.
So for those landlords out there imagining themselves, calling in the cavalry after a single missed payment, pump the brakes. You got to meet the criteria.
Absolutely. And even if you've got that signed lease and enough overdue rent, there's one more crucial step before things escalate to seizing assets.
Okay.
The 7-day notice period.
So it's not a gotcha situation.
No.
The tenant has a chance to make things right.
Exactly. That notice isn't just a courtesy, it's a legal requirement. The tenant has a full 7 days to either pay the outstanding amount in full or at the very least try to, negotiate a payment plan with the landlord to avoid any further action. It's actually designed to encourage communication and resolution.
Okay.
Not just punishment.
That makes sense. So it seems like CRS is more about prompting action than just blindsiding someone.
Exactly.
But let's say the tenant ghosts you, ignores the notice, still doesn't pay. That's when things get real, right?
Yeah.
What actually happens when CRR goes into full effect? All right, so the clock's ticking, those 7 days are up, and our tenant has gone radio silent.
So I'm guessing this is where that enforcement agent steps in.
Right.
But it's not like they just kick down the door, right?
No, not quite a Hollywood action scene, but it can certainly feel high stakes for that tenant.
So walk us through it. What actually happens when that enforcement agent arrives?
First and foremost, everything is by the book. This agent, they're a certified professional. They'll arrive during business hours. They'll identify themselves, and they present the paperwork. It's called the Notice of Enforcement, and it formally outlines the situation. How much is owed, the fact that the 7-day grace period has passed, and what's about to happen next.
I bet you could cut the tension with a knife at that point.
Oh, absolutely.
It's suddenly very real for the tenant.
Very real, yeah.
Okay, so the agent's there, the paperwork's been served. Do they just start grabbing whatever's not nailed down?
Well, there's a method to it, and thankfully it's not a free-for-all. The agent is looking for specific types of assets. Things that belong to the tenant, are on the business premises, and most importantly, have a resale value.
So no swiping someone's, lucky coffee mug or family photos off the desk?
No.
What kind of stuff are we talking about here?
Think office equipment. Computers, printers, maybe even that fancy espresso machine our cafe owner thought they just had to have.
Ouch, yeah, starting to feel the pain already.
Surplus stock is another big one. Imagine a clothing store with racks of unsold inventory. That's prime for seizure. And then there are vehicles used for the business, delivery vans, company cars, things like that.
So it's strategic. They're targeting things that can actually be turned into cash to cover that unpaid rent.
Right.
It's like repossessing a car loan, but for businesses.
That's a great analogy.
Now, the enforcement agent, they'll carefully document everything. They'll create an inventory of the seized goods and note their estimated value. And importantly, a notice will be left at the premises stating that those items are now under their control.
Okay, so the metaphorical hammer has dropped.
Right.
The assets are essentially frozen. But this isn't the final act yet, is it? There's still a chance for the tenant to turn things around, even at this stage, right?
Absolutely. Even with their fancy espresso machine tagged and ready to go, the tenant can still stop the process in its tracks.
What's the magic word? Asking for a friend?
Payment. And not just a promise to pay this time. They need to settle the outstanding rent in full, plus any reasonable costs that the landlord's incurred up to that point, like those enforcement agent fees.
So it's a strong incentive to finally take action.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to lose those valuable business assets if they can help it.
Right.
But what if, despite all this, they still don't pay?
Right.
Do they just wave goodbye to their stuff? What's the final act of this whole CRAR saga?
If the tenant remains completely unresponsive and that debt remains unpaid, the enforcement agent has the authority to sell those seized goods.
Auction time.
Right.
I'm already imagining the bidding wars over slightly used office chairs.
Yeah.
But on a serious note, what does that process actually look like?
It's usually a public auction, although it can be a private sale if it makes more sense for the type of assets that have been seized.
Right.
The key thing is the proceeds from that sale are then used to cover the unpaid rent, as well as any of those fees and costs associated with the whole CRAR process.
Okay, so it's designed to make the landlord whole again?
Yeah.
At least as much as possible given the circumstances.
Precisely. The goal is to recoup that lost rent, not necessarily to profit from the tenant's misfortune.
From what we've covered so far, it seems like CRR can be a pretty powerful tool for landlords. It does sound pretty powerful, but I'd imagine it's not always a slam dunk for landlords, is it? I mean, if CRR was a surefire win every time everyone would use it.
Yeah.
So what are some of the potential downsides or situations where it might not be the best option?
Yeah, you're right to be cautious. While CRR definitely has its advantages, it's not a magic bullet. Perhaps the biggest caveat is that it hinges on the tenant actually having assets of value.
Right.
I mean, if the business is already on shaky ground financially, there might not be much there worth seizing,
Right.
let alone enough to cover the debt and those CRR costs we talked about.
Yeah, it's like hoping the gambler at the back of the casino has a stash of gooey bars hidden somewhere.
Right, exactly.
Sometimes you hit the jackpot. Sometimes you're left holding an empty bag.
Exactly. And even if there are assets, there's always a risk that, a savvy tenant might try to move or hide valuable items before the enforcement agent arrives.
Sneaky.
That's why good record keeping is so crucial for landlords.
Okay, so let's talk strategy then for landlords who are considering going down the CRA route. What are some key things they should keep in mind to, navigate this process effectively, but also fairly?
Documentation is key, and I really can't emphasize this enough.
Okay.
Keep meticulous records of everything. The lease agreement, the rent payment history, any communication with the tenant regarding the arrears, literally anything that can serve as evidence if the CRAR process is challenged.
So dot your I's and cross your T's, basically.
Exactly.
Create a paper trail you could follow through a blizzard.
Precisely. And while CRAR is a powerful tool, it's not a free pass for landlords to just act unilaterally.
Right.
Tenants still have rights, and one of those is the right to actually challenge a SOAR action in court.
Okay.
If they believe it's being used unfairly, or if they dispute the amount of rent owed, they can fight back.
Right, so it's not like playing a get-out-of-jail-free card in Monopoly.
Right.
You have to play by the rules, and there can be consequences if you don't.
Absolutely. That's why transparency and clear communication are so essential throughout the whole process. If rent arrears are becoming a concern, landlords should be upfront with their tenants about the potential use of CRAR. It encourages dialogue, and it might even lead to a resolution before things escalate.
Sure, so it's about, even when you're dealing with what could be quite a difficult situation, maintaining that professional and respectful approach.
Exactly. It's not about blindsiding the tenant. It's about making sure everyone understands the potential consequences and has a fair chance to actually try and rectify the situation.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a bit, this whole deep dive into CRR, it's got me thinking about the bigger picture. If we're seeing more and more landlords having to resort to this method, does that, I don't know, tell us something about the overall health of the commercial rental market as a whole?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the increased use of CRR, it could be a sign of larger economic pressures at play.
Right.
Our business is struggling more than usual to make rent these days. Our landlords feeling less secure and therefore kind of quicker to turn to these, well, let's be honest, more aggressive debt recovery methods.
Yeah, it's like CRR is a small window into a much larger economic landscape that's going on.
Exactly. It highlights the interconnectedness of things and, it encourages us to look beyond just that immediate issue of rent arrears to consider some of those broader economic forces at play.
Well, there you have it. So for our listeners who are keen to keep exploring, it sounds like diving into topics like commercial lease agreements, tenant rights, and those alternative debt recovery methods you mentioned, those could be some fascinating next steps.
Absolutely. There's a wealth of knowledge out there waiting to be uncovered.
As always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of CRR.
Thank you.
It's been enlightening. Until next time, happy renting.